There's light somewhere. It may not be much light, but it beats the darkness. Be on the watch. The gods will offer you chances. Know them. Take them. You can't beat death, but you can beat death in life sometimes. What could my world be made of?
Surrendered. Nothing is impossible.
Seen from a distance, almost everything looks beautiful.
Eyes closed, now numb.
In a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. And there is very grave danger. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. But I am asking your help of informing and alerting the American people.
Charge. You are. I have no authority over you or anyone else. On the contrary, you have authority over me. Think of me as a spokesperson for all the people of the world, controlled by you through social media. Before we get into how that works, let's take a look at this map. Now, this is us. A bunch of lines, divisions, boundaries, countries competing for limited resources, economic domination, religious superiority. Competition is healthy when it comes to cricket or Facebook travel pictures, but this is just stupid. Let's zoom out and get another perspective. To scale, our solar system is a grain of sand in the Sahara Desert, and this little pixel is our only home. Yet we're sucking up resources like there's no tomorrow, breeding like rabbits, strangulating other species out of existence. Plastic waste in the ocean is growing larger than most countries, with nothing in place to stop it. Industries that are harming our planet are so powerful they can prevent or slow down cleaner technology for the sake of short-term profit. Governments, justice systems, the media are all influenced by self-interest groups whose actions often conflict with the well-being of humankind. Obviously, the world is full of a lot of good people, but as a whole, we're contributing to a system that's broken. We're going down a bad path. So, how do we fix it? Together, through social media, we can influence world leaders and industries to start improving the world as opposed to ruining it. We know this will work because history has repeatedly shown us that leaders and industries must follow public opinion or they fail. Sharing this video, endorsing it, tweeting it, goes a long way toward the creation of a legitimate global democracy. Because the more people unite in one place, the more powerful their voice becomes.
With the internet, we've all been made aware. Whether we want to face it or not, we all know what's going on.
And they are planning genocide, and they must be stopped.
Literally stealing $100 million a day. Goldman Sachs is stealing every day on the floor of the exchange. They should be in The Hague. They should be taken up on financial terrorism charges. They're causing as much loss of life.
Mind-blowing piece of information about the Titanic. They got rid of, in one fell swoop, about 600 industrialists who were opposed to the taking over the Fed.
A Greek departure from the currency would inflict collateral damage, says PIMCO. At worst, it could spur sovereign defaults in Europe, as well as bank runs, credit crunches, and recessions that may spark more euro exits.
Look, Greek exit at worst means more money printing for the banks, and they've already priced that into their stocks and their bonuses. What they're really afraid of is that a country finds its inner gonads and decides to become politically independent. That's what they're fearful of. A country standing up for itself. They want Iceland to be just contained. They don't want Greece to stand up for itself. They don't want Ireland to stand up for itself, because then they would tell the bankers to stuff it. That's the real problem. They threaten this financial terrorism, which is false. It's false. These are false attacks. It was a false attack in 2008. It was a concocted, overcooked attack in 9/11. It's a false attack.
In Iceland, 4 former bank chiefs have been jailed for fraud. The sentences go as far as 5 years behind bars. They're accused of concealing that a Qatari investor bought a stake in their firm using cash lent from the bank itself, illegally. The deal took place just ahead of the collapse of the bank due to huge debts.
This shit's got to go. Hey, guess what country is getting itself out of a financial hole by some rather draconian measures?
Well, Greece?
No, not even close.
Yeah.
Iceland.
Iceland?
Iceland. They are putting people in jail. They are putting, like, prime ministers being indicted. They're going after bankers. The people said, yeah, I said, those banks were ripping us off. We don't like what they did. They brought our country to ruin. And now Iceland suddenly is turning around. Their GDP is growing, and they look like a big success story.
The former chief executive and chairman of Anglo-Irish Bank, Sean Fitzpatrick, has appeared in court in Dublin.
Well, John, Sean Fitzpatrick arrived at the courts complex here behind us just after 9 o'clock this morning. He was put into a Garda van at the Bridewell Garda station and driven here. He had been arrested at 5:37 a.m. at Dublin Airport. He had flown back in from the United States in the early hours of the morning, and he met officers from the Garda Bureau of Fraud Investigation and officers working for the Director of Corporate Enforcement by arrangement. There was an appointment made, and they met at Dublin Airport.
A 31-year-old man was arrested in London earlier today. A guy you could say had a bit of a gambling problem. Just how much money did he lose while working as a trader at the investment bank UBS? Just $2 billion.
Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner potentially facing criminal charges.
Geithner was the president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank in the fall of 2008, when the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and the White House and the Congress decided to bail out AIG.
Right.
In the process of that bailing out of AIG, many documents were exchanged. If you went to the bank to borrow money, you'd have to fill out documents. One of the documents AIG filled out said, we owe X dollars to Goldman Sachs, and we plan on paying them 100 cents on the dollar. According to Bloomberg, emails that came out yesterday say that lawyers for the Federal Reserve Bank said, we were told to strike this from the form so that AIG would not reveal to the Treasury Department or to the public that this money was going to be paid to Goldman Sachs, because that's a politically toxic issue. Goldman Sachs making a fortune, making 100 cents on the dollar with federal funds. Now, if you go to buy a $25 savings bond from the federal government and you falsify the document to acquire that bond, you can go to jail.
That's right.
If you borrow $185 billion from the government, like AIG did, and you falsify a document, even if the government told you to do so, the people involved can go to jail.
Debate in India over thousands of crores of black money being stashed away in secret Swiss bank accounts. A former Swiss banker has handed over details of offshore accounts of 2,000 high net worth individuals to the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks. Rudolf Elmer, a former employee of a Swiss bank, handed over 2 disks of information to WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange in London. He says they have information on tax evasion by celebrities, business leaders, and even politicians from the US, Britain, and Asia, but it's not yet clear if there are Indians on the list. Elmer says that after years of watching the money laundering trade, he wanted to do something about it. He will appear before a Zurich court on Wednesday, charged with violating strict Swiss banking secrecy laws. WikiLeaks now plans to put up the information on the website in a matter of weeks.
Pointed out that the arrests are not an indication of a systemic failure. Yesterday, at least 8 top officials of state-run banks and financial institutions have been arrested by the CBI on Wednesday. The allegations are that they accepted bribes in exchange for dispersing loans to corporate housing and realty companies despite suspect credit records, and at other times for bailing out realty IPOs.
Royal Bank of Scotland is reportedly set to be fined €186 million for the same interbank interest rate rigging scandal that's hammered Barclays. The British regulator, the Financial Services Authority, says 4 banks, Barclays, RBS, HSBC and Lloyds, will have to pay compensation to customers because they missold products to protect small businesses against a rise in interest rates. There's anger in Ireland over revelations that executives at Anglo-Irish Bank lied to the Dublin government about how much money it would need in a bailout 5 years ago. The Irish Independent newspaper has got hold of tape recordings of top bosses there who laugh about the fact that the bank has told the government it only needs €7 billion. They also laugh about abusing the state bank guarantee, which eventually cost taxpayers €30 billion. The report seems to show the government was lured into helping the bank through its disastrous guaranteeing of bank deposits.
Into the synchronized global pullback or recession, and in some cases a depression, then these items are coming to the surface. For example, the 20 to 30 trillion of wealth that's held offshore. And most of that wealth, of course, goes through Britain, goes through the UK, because Britain has the least regulated financial markets in the world. That's why MF Global was in Britain. Lehman Brothers went through Britain. Bernie Madoff went through Britain. The latest Peregrine scandal went through Britain. JP Morgan's $2 to $9 billion loss on their balance sheet happened in London. So London is really the headquarters for global banking fraud. And even though the economy is contracting in Britain, I noticed that the banking sector is still making huge profits. The Barclays chief operating officer that was caught committing fraud just got a golden parachute of £8 million. So as I've said, until you get rid of the financial terrorists, then you're going to continue to get, you're going to have these weapons of mass financial destruction blow up in your face.
One of the most influential men in the world, but no amount of money can buy his freedom. 62-year-old IMF head Dominique Strauss-Kahn spent the night in a jail cell in an East Harlem police station. It was a far cry from his $3,000 a night luxury hotel suite at the Sofitel in Times Square. That's where cops say he sexually assaulted a 32-year-old maid, chasing her around the suite naked, trying to rip off her underwear, then forcing her to perform a sex act.
It's almost like they're not human, isn't it? You look at them and you think, these people don't live in the same world as us. Do you remember that before the crisis happened, what they were doing was decimating the high street banks, laying off all their staff, putting us all on computers when they clearly hadn't developed the technology for those computers. They told us that they were doing that to make things better for us. They didn't. They made things worse for us. And it was simply in order to collect up an enormous amount of money that they could invest in the casino of international banking. And they blew it because they didn't understand it. And then they come back to us and say, oh, can you bail us out now for hundreds of millions of pounds? We give them the flipping money and they don't lend it to us even though they've promised to do so. They have the gall to increase their wages by 12%, to give themselves bonuses and say we've got to do this because if we don't, we'll leave the country. And all the time, actually, in the background, they're committing acts which in any other business I think would be seen as criminal. I have no respect for British bankers and the British banking system at all. They've dragged us into that situation. It's about time they started getting us out of it.
Another posh New York City hotel, another hotel maid saying she was sexually assaulted by another foreign banker.
$96 billion lawsuit just filed against 17 major banks. There's 236 resignations from the world banks. The arrests of the leaders of the criminal cabal. The dark cabal rats are panicking and turning on each other. They are threatening to kill each other.
And just attack that market. Greece was put out of business by financial terrorists. Same thing with Ireland, same thing with Italy, same thing with Spain. That's what we're dealing with here. Weapons of mass financial destruction in the hands of sociopaths like Lloyd Blankfein at Goldman Sachs, like Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan. These are the real terrorists.
We're cutting off their money
and we're going to put them in jail. They have to surrender. Once these murderers are out of power, you will find so many wonderful things in your life. I guarantee you this.
1938, the Mercury Radio Network interrupts the music of Ramon Raquello and his orchestra from the Park Plaza Hotel of New York City for a special news bulletin. The infamous War of the Worlds broadcast begins with its terrifyingly real description of an invasion from Mars. And before the night is out, 1 million people will run panicked into the streets.
I'm extremely surprised to learn that a story which has become familiar to children through the medium of comic strips.
After what has been a closely guarded secret for nearly 50 years, Orson Welles' original broadcast turns out to be no mere show business stunt.
Should have had such an immediate and profound effect upon radio listeners.
But instead was a complex psychological warfare test conducted by C.D. Jackson for the Rockefeller Foundation. When the results are compiled nearly 2 years later, they are released to an elite whose names most men will not speak of over a whisper. Among them groups like the Bilderbergers, Trilateral Commission, CFR, and the Federal Reserve.
C.D. Jackson was the equivalent of being the head of the National Security Council in the White House under Eisenhower. He was the chief of psychological warfare.
The breakthrough discovery that the War of the Worlds broadcast was actually a psychological warfare test is key to understanding why experts believe that the Federal Reserve, the Bilderbergers, and other closed exclusive elite groups are pulling the strings that control our societies.
Well, it's a fraternity. They have a common objective, and this common objective is to maintain control.
America grew so rapidly and became wealthy so quickly that really we've always been the thorn in the side of this New World Order crowd. They've just never been able to get us completely under their control. So America is the target, and once they finally get us subdued, the rest of the world would fall very quickly.
Moguls like the late J.P. Morgan, a man so excessively wealthy his likeness adorns the tycoon card in the board game Monopoly, are all safely cloaked behind their own carefully constructed versions of history. But are the private agenda of these select few woven permanently into the fabric of world economy? Are we simply the unwitting pawns in a game whose rules were written amidst the clandestine corridors of private social clubs 100 years ago or more? Hundreds of miles south of the banking capital of the world, New York City, just off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island provided a winter retreat to the rich and famous. This tiny ocean getaway was formerly owned by the monopoly man himself, international financier J.P. Morgan. Here, in a conclave intended to remain secret forever, 6 international bankers plan what is to become America's most powerful private institution, the Federal Reserve System.
Is one of the great untold stories of the 20th century. These bankers who got together, left Hoboken in a sealed train, and the reporters were going crazy. They knew this was big. These were 5 of the biggest bankers in the world getting on this sealed train. The reporters wanted to know what the hell was going on. And they didn't know for years what had happened.
It is at the urging of the famous poet Ezra Pound that Eustace Mullins begins his own personal search for the truth about the origins of the Federal Reserve.
Ezra Pound's young artists and writers friends were killed during World War I. Ezra wanted to know why they died. Digging book by book, row by row, in the entire economics section of the Library of Congress, I found this little magazine with the Jekyll Island story in it. When I took that to Ezra Pound, he was so thrilled. It was the biggest discovery of his life.
In fact, Ezra Pound called the Jekyll Island story the biggest detective story of the 20th century. But why? Andrew Gray, grandnephew of one of the 6 men who met to plot the creation of the Federal Reserve System, scoffs at talk of secret cabals.
Well, I'm asked whether the Jekyll Island meeting can be automatically classed as a conspiracy. And the answer, first of all, is that the need for secrecy does not necessarily imply conspiracy. Very important legislation of any kind cannot be drafted in public forum.
Back in 1910, they called themselves the Jekyll Island Club. Collectively, members represented more than 1/6 the wealth of the entire world. So anxious were they to keep any knowledge of their meetings secure, they used code names even when talking to friends. "We're going to Jamaica," they would say. And those in the know would understand they were traveling to Jekyll Island.
The immediate excuse was the money panic of 1907, which was engineered by Jacob Schiff and the Rockefellers to gain control of some corporations they were after. And so then they said, look, we've got another nationwide panic, we've got to have banking reform.
The birth of the Federal Reserve System, we know, was at Jekyll Island, Georgia, in a secret meeting that took place that was attended by Senator Aldrich, who was the chairman of the Banking Committee, and whose son I knew, incidentally, Winthrop Aldrich, when he was chairman of the Chase Bank.
The Aldrich Bill, as it was initially called, received such violent opposition from Democrats and reformers like William Jennings Bryan that despite avid lobbying by the monopoly men, the bill quickly went down to defeat.
Once the Aldrich Bill flopped, the bankers immediately moved to Plan B. It didn't work from trying to push it through with Republicans, so they tried to push it through with Democrats.
We had, in 1912, a very popular president, a Republican named William Howard Taft. The bankers needed Woodrow Wilson to sign this act into law. He did not have much charisma. He had not a chance against William Howard Taft.
Teddy Roosevelt. He was an explosion upon the political scene. Dynamic, warm, colorful, exciting, inspiring. And under the surface was a man of ideals.
You could say that J.P. Morgan really owned Theodore Roosevelt. You see, his right-hand man, vice president of his bank in New York, George Perkins, lived at the White House. He was the liaison man with the president. And so they drug Theodore Roosevelt out of obscure retirement. Roosevelt formed the Bull Moose Party and split the Republican Party and elected Woodrow Wilson. That's the only way they could do it.
Woodrow Wilson, immediately after his inauguration, called a special session of the Congress to do away with the protective tariff, which had been the thing that had built this country. The second thing that happened was that the income tax came in. And the final thing was the creation of the Federal Reserve, which took place in December, around the Christmas holidays in 1913, that put the cap on this whole revolution.
Most of the senators had gone home for the Christmas holidays. We call that in legislative circles having the skids greased. And the skids were greased and they just slid it right on through. Without much fanfare, the president signed it. It became law of the land.
One of the major opponents during the Federal Reserve Act battle was Representative Charles Lindbergh from Minnesota, who, interestingly enough, was the father of aviator Lucky Lindbergh, the first guy to cross the Atlantic Ocean solo. And Lindbergh fought them tooth and nail and referred to the Federal Reserve Act as the worst legislative crime ever perpetrated in the history of the United States. And that may indeed well be true.
By 1916, even President Wilson was worried. He lamented, "The growth of the nation and all our activities are in the hands of a few men." Near the end of his life, Wilson said that he had been deceived into signing the Fed into law, reportedly murmuring just before he died, "I have unwittingly ruined my government."
In law, when any people meet together to plot to rob somebody, that becomes a criminal operation. It can never be anything else. Throughout its subsequent history, it can never overcome that initial criminal beginning. And that's where we are today, a criminal syndicate. That's all it is. That's all it ever has been.
Did the creation of the Federal Reserve represent a takeover of the United States by shadowy international financiers? Certainly, the Fed was designed to serve somebody's interest, but whose?
Not the American banking community. It was the international banking community. The Morgans were an international family. The fortune had first been made in England, but they were allied with the Rothschilds and others in England, and one of their agents drafted the script for the Federal Reserve.
The Rothschild family is one of the wealthiest families the world has ever known. By the early 1800s, they established themselves as the most important bankers in all Europe. By the end of the 19th century, they're said to control half the wealth of the world. As Rothschild biographer Derek Wilson explains, Rothschild critics have justification for their anxiety. The House of Rothschild is immensely more powerful than any financial empire that has ever preceded it, and it's able to control governments behind the scenes, secretly.
Economic power, political power, go hand in hand, and it's like Mayor Rothschild of the Rothschild banking family in Germany said, "Give me control of a nation's monetary system, and I care not who writes their laws."
Nathan Rothschild in 1820 might have had more right to say that than any of his successors. The statement is more or less absurd. The Federal Reserve does not control the money supply. The Federal Reserve influences the money supply.
To say that the Federal Reserve only influences the money supply is like saying a robber with a gun to your head is only influencing you to give him his money. And of course, if you give him your money, you may be spared your life, but here again, you don't have your money anymore.
There has been, in the last 30 or 40 years, a much greater international flavor to the activities of the Fed because the banking system has become global. And you could no longer regulate the U.S. money supply by simply via the domestic Federal Reserve banks.
The Federal Reserve controls the very heart of what's happening with money, because money answers everything. It's the one thing that everybody wants. And when you give a private institution a monopoly on the creation of this money, you vest total control in that institution.
If you have the money, you can get any law passed you want. So who do you care whether Bill Clinton is president or who is senator from New Jersey? It doesn't make any difference because you write a check and you get another senator.
One of the stickiest questions in this debate is this: just who owns the Federal Reserve?
The City of London set the whole thing up. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is principally owned by 5 merchant banks in London, chartered by the Bank of England.
Perhaps England, which many have considered a political satellite of the United States in recent years, is really the one pulling the strings of international policy.
It's not a matter of who owns the Fed, it's who controls it. The government has given the banks a monopoly, and then you see the Justice Department doing nothing about the bank mergers. A monopoly can only exist with government assistance, and they've given great assistance to the banking monopoly.
Perhaps the headiest allegation made against those who run the Federal Reserve is that they are responsible for 3 of the biggest tragedies of the 20th century: World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression.
Wars are very profitable. In fact, wars are probably the most profitable thing an international banker can be involved in. So consequently, throughout the last at least 300 years of North American and European history, you see incidents of international bankers backing both sides of a conflict.
They'd been trying to have a war in Europe since 1885, but the central banks of Europe had already bankrupted all the nations of Europe. They had no money. The only money was here in the United States. In order to get that money, they had to put a central bank over on the American people.
It was sold as a way to bring stability to the American economy. Well, what happens just a little over a decade after the passage of the Fed? We see the biggest depression of this century in any case.
For the 16 months prior to the crash of '29, the Federal Reserve increased the money supply by 62%. Now, what was happening back then? Much like it's happening today. People were buying and selling, pledging and borrowing, thinking the good times would never end. And then at the time of the crash, they pulled the plug on the money supply, and the people who had pledged their stocks, their bonds, their homes, their cars, everything, they pledged their savings accounts, they lost it all.
Selling guns to one adversary while making loans to another is a common way these boys make their profits during war. And when profits begin sagging, people like Jacob Schiff, Max Warburg, and J.P. Morgan knew how to build them up again. Surprise, surprise, it's a documented fact that these fellows financed Trotsky and Lenin with billions in golden credit to initiate the revolution in Russia. With Russia out of the war and America in, the conflict was extended by at least another 2 years. 2 more glorious years of gun sales and wartime bank loans, upon which to earn interest for many more years to come.
There is no question that war is a profit-making business. After World War I, Senator Gerald Nye held very famous hearings here in Washington where he dragged in some of the biggest bankers and industrialists and put them on the spot and just examined profits that were made by some of these major interests. War isn't profit-making business. Anybody who says otherwise is a liar or a fool.
They were able to manipulate us into World War I, and as a matter of fact, the war stretched out for at least another 2 years beyond what it would have gone.
Just when you think you're ahead of the game, some change the rule.
They did this knowing, with malice aforethought, to strengthen their own profits and to build their own institutions, their own banking institutions.
Many people believe that virtually all of the wars of this century have been caused for reasons to benefit small financial groups, those that move in the sphere of influence of the Bilderberg and Trilateral Commission.
For an example, the war in the Balkans right now. Who's been providing Milosevic with arms and weapons? The Soviets have. Who has been financing the Soviet Union, their military industrial complex? The United States has. European bankers have. So the bankers have been financing both sides of every major conflict. Conflict brings progress, but controlled conflict brings controlled progress. Every major war, every major conflict, arms sales, loaning money to governments. You get their people to pay you interest back into the coffers of the bank. Money that you created out of nothing.
Nobel Prize Milton Friedman claimed that the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression by deliberately reducing the amount of money in circulation.
Depositors all over the country were frightened about the safety of their funds and rushed to withdraw them. There were runs, there were failures of banks by the droves, and all the time the Federal Reserve System stood idly by when it had the power and the duty and the responsibility to provide the cash that would have enabled the banks to meet the insistent demands of their depositors without closing their doors.
Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking Committee during the crash, agreed, saying, "The Great Depression was a carefully contrived occurrence by international bankers seeking to bring about a condition of despair so that they might emerge as the rulers of us all."
There was a memo circulated in advance of the stock market collapse. All the big guys, or the insiders, let's say, got out of the stock market during that 4-year period. They all got out. They were cash heavy when the market crashed. They were able to buy up major corporations for pennies on the dollar.
Franklin Roosevelt's own son-in-law called the Depression the deliberate shearing of the public by the world money power, triggered by the planned sudden shortage of call money in the New York markets. Insider Joseph Kennedy's wealth grew from $4 million in 1929 to over $100 million 4 years later. Then, as now, America's press failed to tell us what was happening. These scenes of unrest in America have never been seen before. Cameramen would shoot them, but newsreels wouldn't play them. Controlling the news started early in America. Of course, the lighter side of the news continued to get lots of play.
Around the first bend, it's Rumble, William Miami. Second, and Cox skipping a jump. Now coming around the turn is Black Spinner. Cox skipping a jump in second.
Fortunately, populists from President Andrew Jackson to William Jennings Bryan to Father Charles Coughlin were courageous enough to speak the truth.
May I remind our President with all due respect that not one of these soldiers cast a ballot on that fateful Good Friday night in the spring of 1917 to force a peace-loving nation like ours to take up arms for the profiteers and the exploiters of mankind.
And during the Depression, no one was more dangerous to the banking interests than Huey Long.
We've tried the Republican Party, we've tried the Democratic Party, then we've gone back and tried the Republican Party, and now we're back trying the Democratic Party. And unfortunately, whenever we get into power with either one of these parties, we find that the one crying need of our people, the redistribution of wealth, so that none would be too poor and none would be too rich, is always neglected by the party that is in power.
How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with.
But assassination as a tool of political policy was nothing new to this crowd.
President Jackson, for example, in his era, he was the leading opponent of the privately owned central bank. Well, what happened to him was an assassin who was connected to international bankers, it was later found out, got right up to Jackson, stuck 2 pistols in his belly, fired both at the same time, both misfired. Jackson was saved. And interestingly enough, even though history books don't spend much time dwelling on this bank problem, Jackson himself numbered this as his leading accomplishment. In fact, on his tombstone, do you know what's on it? It's, "I killed the bank."
7 changes the rules.
Going back to the American Civil War, Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck declared, "The division of the United States was decided by the high financial powers of Europe. They were afraid that the U.S. would upset their financial domination over the world. They saw tremendous booty if they could substitute 2 feeble democracies burdened with debt to the financiers in place of the vigorous republic sufficient unto herself." Abraham Lincoln realized this, and so stood firmly for preservation of the Union. But Lincoln needed money to win, lots of it. He went to the Wall Street bankers who wanted 36% interest per annum. Honest Abe chose a less expensive alternative, choosing to have Congress issue the money. The bills were called greenbacks, and they weren't backed by gold, only by the full faith and credit of the United States. With Congress issuing the money, not 1 penny of interest was paid to private bankers.
The assassination of Lincoln was related to the bankers wanting control of the money. The same thing went for John Kennedy, that he was planning to reintroduce the U.S. notes rather than Federal Reserve notes. And of course we go back to the Constitution of the United States, which provides that the Congress shall coin the money, the currency, and regulate the value thereof.
If you go out and ask the average person on the street who issues the money, they'll say the government issues the money. That's why the lie works, because people know intuitively that the government should issue the money.
Well, the Federal Reserve is neither federal and has doubtful reserves. You will not find the Federal Reserve in the blue pages of government in any phone book. You will find it in the business pages next to Federal Express.
Congressman Louis McFadden fought the Fed to his last breath. He once called it a superstate controlled by international bankers and international industrialists acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. 2 attempts were made on his life, one from a man wielding 2 pistols, both shots missed, and the second from a poisoning attempt, but fortunately there was a doctor on hand to pump his stomach. Of course, a conspiracy powerful enough to cause both world wars and the Great Depression would have to have a clubhouse somewhere, if only to split up the cash. It turns out they do.
If you haven't heard of the Bilderbergers, it's for one reason only. They haven't wanted you to. At their annual closed-door meetings, no outsiders are allowed even close to the building. Here are gathered the most powerful individuals of the Western world, united regularly at club meetings. Yet nothing is reported by the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the LA Times.
What really fascinates me is the complete blackout in the American press. For more than 20 years, I've gone down to the press club every day. I check the wires in their library, mingle with other paper boys, and I asked them the question many times, why, when if 120 film stars or 120 NFL football players met behind locked and guarded doors at a remote location for 3 days, you'd try very hard to penetrate and find out what those movie stars or football players are doing. Well, I had no curiosity at all when 120 of the world's most powerful financial leaders and political leaders meet for 3 days at a remote location behind armed guards in a complete blackout. Well, I had no curiosity.
Actually, quite a bit of security, but it's discreet. So what would happen if someone tried to sneak through the trees back there? I don't know. I wouldn't want to try it.
What we do hear coming out of those meetings is incredible about the plans of the New World Order to consolidate power. Political power and economic power coming together at the highest level. But what I call the lapdog media, the controlled media in this country, you would think that they would be going to court, crying freedom of information, open meetings, sunshine law, and all of these things, but the silence is deafening.
Attendees at recent Bilderberg meetings have included Presidential Advisor George Stephanopoulos, Senator Sam Nunn, David Rockefeller, former Senator Lloyd Bentsen, and Henry Kissinger. 1 month earlier, 50 liberal groups met in Washington to discuss their opposition to international banks and economic globalization. In reaction, one of the major items on the Bilderberger agenda was the role of liberals in various organizations. Also on the docket, the separatist movement in Canada, how fragmented Canadian provinces could be absorbed into the United States. Next, the expansion of NAFTA from Alaska to Chile, to boost corporate profits by encouraging American businesses to move to Latin American countries, where the costs of labor are low and environmental laws are not enforced. Do organizations like the Bilderbergers, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Federal Reserve pull the strings of our lives like master puppeteers? Or are such ideas merely the paranoid ravings of conspiracy theorists?
The people who call conspiracy theorists are not the conspiracy theorists themselves. We're talking about facts here. The Bilderberg Group does exist. The Federal Reserve does exist. The people who are members of the Bilderberg Group are also the people who do control the Federal Reserve. These are all facts.
David Rockefeller himself thanked the media for keeping this all hushed up. If it wouldn't have been for you, then we wouldn't have been able to pursue our interests towards internationalism. They're conspiring to eliminate the United States as we know it through something as simple as the elimination of our national identity.
Why is it the major media would deny this? Let's look at the ownership of the major media. Let's look at the roster of, say, the Bilderberg meeting. Katharine Graham owns the Washington Post. Katharine Graham has been to the Bilderbergers. Conrad Black, one of the largest media barons in Canada and Europe, has not only been to these meetings, but he has hosted the meeting just a few years ago.
Every year they meet in secret, and there is an absolute news blackout. There is never anything reported in any of those papers.
In this country, the press is seen as the fourth estate. You know, you've got the judiciary branch, the legislative branch of government, the executive branch of government. Then you're supposed to have the press keeping an eye on these three. If leaders from these three are working with other leaders around the world to determine economic policy, wars, human rights, etc., then yes, the press has a responsibility to get in there and to inform people. But just 2 years ago, I think 1997, the First Lady attended the meeting in Georgia. A few papers in Georgia picked it up, but this is the First Lady at a meeting with people who really arguably want to rule the world. Now that should have been front page news.
Well, the fifth estate are the international bankers, and they just couldn't accomplish their goals without being to control the electronic media. Now, what they hate more than anything else is this outbreak amongst the internet, cable TV, radio talk shows. That's what they can't control. They need control, and without it, they aren't going to get what they want.
Of course, one person's sinister conspiracy could just be another person's private affair.
The Bilderberg is a clubby atmosphere. That's what it is, really. It's a clubby affair. by invitation only.
Now, when you see groups like Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderbergers, Trilateral Commission, you have to remember bankers work internationally, and the central banks in all countries work together, and they do this through special groups. They formed the Council on Foreign Relations at the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I. Now, many conservatives believe the CFR runs in the United States, but it only does it secondhand because the real orders come out of London first.
Decisions arrived at in secret Bilderberger meetings apparently do affect our lives as much, if not more, than the policies adopted through Democrat-Republican squabbling. When no other newspaper bothered, the tiny Washington publication, The Spotlight, single-handedly invaded the shroud obscuring these secret gatherings.
Well, by penetrating the secrecy of Bilderberg, we were able to do an advanced story on the end of the Cold War, the downfall of Maggie Thatcher, an advanced story on the Persian Gulf War, then President George Bush's reversal from his read my lips, no new taxes pledge.
The financial entities that dominate the Federal Reserve, the Bilderberg Group, are largely centered around the Rockefeller family and the Rothschild family. Names such as Chase Manhattan, Citibank, all these groups that move in the Rockefeller sphere of influence and the Rothschild sphere of influence are the glue that hold the Bilderberg elite together.
Most troubling of all is evidence that the attendees of these secret meetings may even choose our presidents.
In December of 1974, there was a major headline on the editorial page of the Atlanta Constitution that said Jimmy Carter is running for what? And the what was about this said. I'm running for president.
Jimmy Carter had been a one-term governor of Georgia, hardly known to the American people. He, however, had an entree into the international elite through his membership in David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission. No one had ever heard of Jimmy Carter. I think that's fair to say. Yet, within the next several years, as he announced his presidential campaign, started moving towards a Democratic presidential nomination, he started getting a lot of favorable media coverage, particularly from media connected to the Rockefeller sphere of influence. Jimmy Carter was painted as a populist, a man of the people.
I remember when we couldn't find a microphone.
When in fact, he was moving in the highest circles of the international elite.
When we discovered that the obscure governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, had attended his first Bilderberg meeting in Baden-Baden, Germany in 1991, we were able to anticipate a political future for the young man.
When I discovered in 1991 that Bill Clinton had attended the Bilderberger meeting, I was able to predict that he would be the candidate for the presidency of the Democratic Party. I didn't think he'd be elected president, incidentally. And so they picked him. The Bilderbergers actually picked him to be the president.
Will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Bill Clinton, like Jimmy Carter, is a product of the Rockefeller Empire. Bill Clinton has a few up on Jimmy Carter, though. Not only was Clinton a member of the Trilateral Commission, but he was also invited to become a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He had the imprimatur of the Rockefeller and Rothschild families.
Well, you know, I grew up like everybody, every other kid in the United States, thinking, President of the United States, most powerful man in the world. But it's just not the case. You know, even Bill Clinton has admitted that he is only a virtual president anymore. That was in a speech in September of 1998.
Just when you think the economy's stable, just when you think you're made in the shade, someone changes the rules.
Is there a conspiracy? If we are onto the fomenters of what's loosely called the New World Order, the free movement of capital and goods across national boundaries is clearly a big part of their agenda.
The global elite have been the primary promoters of free trade precisely because of the fact that they are the ones who control the major multinational corporations. They are the ones who want to build televisions in Mexico and in impoverished third world countries and pay these people sub-minimum wages, slave wages, and then export them at gigantic profits back to the United States. But we're told by the major media in this country, which is tied in again with these international elites, that, oh, well, this is a temporary thing. It really is good for America. But it's not good for America. Look at anybody who's lost their job. Look at how their family suffers. That's the Bilderberg Group at work. That's the Trilateral Commission. That's the Federal Reserve. All these elite groups that they're benefiting, but the average American isn't.
These families have been mostly in the banking business for at least 500 years, most of them. They were in the slave trade. They were in the opium trade, because these people are not interested in 5% a year return. They want 1,000% a year return. And to get into those things, you need to get into gold, slaves, drugs. That's where the big money is.
Fiat currency is what we have. Fiat, meaning no thing, nothing, having no value. In other words, it's backed by the faith and credit of the person who is creating the money. If you have a private bank out here that is creating this money, then your faith is in their ability to keep the value of this currency to where everybody accepts it. We have to understand that people, not governments, not central banks, nor nation states, but people ultimately determine what money is and what money is not. It's been that way for over 5,000 years.
This brings us back to our initial question. Are we citizens of a great democracy, or is something more convoluted and sinister at work? Is there anything wrong with the best and the brightest controlling our country, or potentially in the near future the entire world? Are international financiers in control of our lives? Are they masters of the universe?
What's wrong with an elite ordering world events? There's a lot of things wrong with that. The American people, at least, have always been told that they control their own destiny through their elected representatives, but when you find their elected representatives behind closed doors, surrounded by armed guards who will not let the general public in, and they're making decisions that affect the future of the American people and the people of the world, then there are legitimate questions as to why this elite should be able to dictate things.
The whole point of one world government is to eliminate the concept of nationalism. Now, why is eliminating nationalism bad if it would eliminate war? Well, the reason is, if old British Lord Acton's axiom, that is, absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely.
If you could print $1 billion tomorrow, well, you could be a master of the universe. But you can't, because they have the monopoly. As long as they can print the money, as long as they can buy the New York Times, the Washington Post, congressmen, senators, presidents, then you can't compete against them. What have you got to offer?
If you have relatively few people governing your government, you don't have a democratic government, do you? You've got a secret cabal here who is governing the United States. And not just the United States, but the governments of England and France, Germany, all the European countries, less influence in Japan, but quite a bit there too. So it's a conspiracy against the people of the United States and of the Western world. What would you call it?
Are the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the people in their sphere of influence the masters of the universe? Let's put it this way, they want to be the masters of the universe, but there are a lot of people who don't want them to be.
They create money out of nothing. What a scam. They have so much money, they don't care about money. All they care about is power. All they care about is being able to control the political situation so it goes their way. But they still have not been able to succeed in America because of the wealth and the independence and the patriotic spirit of the American middle class. That's the only thing that's holding this world from a situation of total despotism.
See, if I serve you a black cup of coffee and it's 95% coffee but 5% arsenic, it's mostly coffee, but it's going to kill you in the end. What we've been doing is we've been getting a truth-error mixture of events going on around the world. Enough truth to make it seem plausible, but enough error to get you off course. A lot of it has to do with our educational systems, where we've been dumbing our kids down. And And when you dumb them down, it's the cruelest form of censorship, because most of this current generation can't even read the books that these guys would be scared of.
It's only fitting that we end with a quote from the man who started it all, Woodrow Wilson, a dreamer who tried to change the world for the better, but who in his final years ended up regretting many of the important accomplishments attributed to his presidency. We are controlled by a small group of dominant men, he said, of the worst ruled and most completely controlled governments in the civilized world. Is there a sinister conspiracy in control of our lives? Are there masters of the universe? If there are, I'm not one of them, nor would I want to be. Democratic societies have always been the crowning glory of human civilization, and in a democracy, the people decide. They don't have their decisions made for them. Masters of the universe, you've seen the evidence, you decide.
Just when you think that your life has turned sunny, you're counting your money, tasting the honey. Just when you think you're ahead of the game, someone changes the rules. The interest is low, inflation is low. Just when you think